Welcome to the Economics Program Core Objectives Plan. My name is Richard Gosselin, and I am the program chair. The core objectives that are mapped to our foundational component area are critical thinking, communication skills, empirical and quantitative skills, and social responsibility. And in this presentation, I'm going to cover how we're going to evaluate each of these areas and the instruments that we've come up with or proposed to measure these core objectives. Under communication skills, the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board has defined it as anything that includes effective written, oral, and visual communication. And as you can see in the 4 communication skills pattern that I have there on the screen, there's thinking, nonverbal, listening, and speaking. And in fact, I think this cartoon is well suited to this because, well, it'll reveal itself. It says, "Buck, you get along with everyone. What's your secret?" And he goes, "Well, nobody hates a listener." So I think the lesson here is that when we think of communication skills, we often think of writing skills and reading, and we think of verbal skills, but we often don't think about the listening aspect. And if you think about that, that doesn't make really a lot of sense, because if there's a speaker but there's no listener, we don't really have any communicating going on. So let's take a look at our proposal. In both macro and microeconomics, the plan is to have students be required to make a video presentation on a topic of their choosing within parameters that are set by the economics program. A subcommittee will be charged with that task and setting up the precise requirements. But the modest proposal is to have students make a 5-minute video presentation using a free screen capturing software, really any other video presentation software of their choosing. And there is an appendix that's provided that demonstrates an example of this, and that'll actually be provided on the Core Objectives website that everyone has access to now, at least all program instructional leaders have access to. And you can see that this fits in very nicely with what we have here. You can measure the context and the purpose of the writing, or in this case, the presentation, the content development, what the student actually writes or says. You can evaluate syntax and mechanics, because you can obviously see whether or not they've written in good American English, whether they have good punctuation and diction and sentence structure, and then the actual form of the oral presentation, the style, the tone, and then the visual presentation and the supporting materials. Many students will probably be using PowerPoint, but they are certainly free to use other devices as well, especially students in face-to-face classes may use phone boards or videos or any other kind of examples or relevant quotes or research data. All right, the second core objective is critical thinking. The definition provided by the board is include creative thinking, innovation, inquiry, and analysis, evaluation, and synthesis of information. All right, what I've come up with is just a catchy little phrase that I stole off the internet, off of a college website. I don't even remember now where I got it from, but anyhow, it's called RED, which stands for Recognize Assumptions, Evaluate Arguments, and Draw Conclusions. This is not any kind of substitute rubric, but it's kind of a key way of thinking about what critical thinking is really all about. So the economics program has decided to use what we call context-rich problems. Our plan is aimed at helping students transfer knowledge from inside the classroom to new situations. Right? In fact, part of the reason for this diagram is to show people on the board, but also show people away from the board doing something else, right? So what is that? Well, here's an example of a traditional problem, not the one that we're going to use, but it's a traditional problem. Often folks in the economics profession will call it chug and plug. Any mathematicians in the room or scientists in the room will certainly recognize that. It's any kind of problem that could be easily formatted into a multiple choice style problem. This is something that we won't be doing, but here's an example. Calculate the present value of $10,000 received in 10 years. Assume a discount rate of 4%. Now, you won't see this formula there, but the student doesn't need the formula because the student, in all likelihood, has memorized the formula. And so the reason why we call it plug and chug is all the student has to do is plug the $10,000 into the future value, plug the 10 in for the number of years, and plug the 0.04 in for the 4% interest rate for the I. And then you can calculate the present value by simply taking the value in the numerator and dividing it by the denominator. Well, that's a pretty straightforward problem. And for any student that's memorized the formula, is able to punch out the present value figure. But that doesn't really require a lot of higher order thinking. So that's where context-rich problems come in. They're a lot different. There really isn't any mere memorization, although memorizing is important. So we don't want to poo-poo this. But there isn't any mindless plugging into these known formulas. The story is personalized. Students must use what they know in a sort of non-standard application. And they have to choose the appropriate concepts and draw the relevant diagrams. Now, we didn't just pull this stuff out of thin air. This is all being adapted from the economics teaching practices, which came from a National Science Foundation grant, which we'll be talking more about later as we move through this presentation. In any event, here's the alternative. It's the same kind of problem. It's worded in a very different way. You and your brother have inherited a U.S. government bond that'll pay $10,000 in 10 years, but will not pay any interest before that time. You agree to share the bond equally, but your brother would like to receive his 1/2 of the bond's value right now. So, how will you explain to your brother, who had not studied economics, how much you should pay him for his share? You ought to recognize something right away about this, and that is, it's not handing you the answer on a silver platter, because number one, necessarily an implication about present discounted value, at least not explicitly. It doesn't even say the phrase expected value, nor does it even say future value. There isn't even a discount rate given. You don't even know what the interest rate is. And the only thing you know is the $10,000 in the 10 years. So there's a lot of sort of missing information and unknown things here. And that's the whole point of a context-rich alternative problem, is to get students to think about what those parameters might be and to come up with a cogent explanation, right? So I think this fits in very nicely with the critical thinking rubric that the state higher education board has come up with, which is you got to have a creative thinking innovation. Clearly, this kind of example is there is an inquiry. It's asking you some kind of a question. And in the end, it's asking you to analyze, to evaluate, and synthesize the information that you already have to advise this person about what to do, how to divvy up the bond money and the bond proceeds. Okay, the next one, the third one, is the empirical and quantitative skills. Now, the definition by the state is to include the manipulation and analysis of numerical data or observable facts resulting in informed conclusions. Now, I've got two separate pictures here. There's a photograph of a bunch of computer terminals, and then, and unfortunately, there's nobody in them. And then there is a picture of a classroom where students are raising their hands. And the reason is that our exercise can be done in two ways. It can be done online through a computer, or it can be done in a face-to-face setting. So how can you do that? Through in-class, in-classroom, and online experiments. Now, what is that? Many people, if they're not in a science discipline, don't have any idea perhaps what we're talking about here, but you might have sort of a vague notion. Well, a classroom experiment does something unique. It puts students in a controlled environment and asks them to make some economic decisions. And their decisions actually become data that the class later analyzes. And participating actually provides an insider's perspective on economic behavior, often in situations that students hadn't encountered in their regular lives. It's kind of an artificial experiment. By using the phrase artificial, that is not meant to be a derogatory phrase. It's meant to be accurate because it's not real. It's not real in the sense that it's not an experiment like a chemistry experiment or a biology experiment or a physics experiment, but it is meaningful in the sense that it can model how people would behave in the real world, even though, of course, we understand that they know that they're being watched. And there is that same kind of problem that psychology has in conducting experiments, but nonetheless, they can be exceedingly useful from a pedagogical perspective. And so here's some economics humor to kind of launch this whole thing. No doubt you've heard this first joke. What do you mean I don't have any money in my checking account? I still have checks left. Now, look at the diagram here. We got a bunch of ships lined up. They've got fishing lines dropped into the water with fishing hooks. And there's just two lonely little fish there that look kind of grim. Now, this is a great introduction to the tragedy of the commons, right? Because here is the alternative quote. What do you mean there's no fish left? I still have a fishing license. That's a classic kind of a case here. Tragedy of the commons is whenever you have some collective good for which no one person has ownership, you tend to have an overuse of that resource. And fishing is a classic example of that. So what's the big idea here? Explaining how destructive human behavior towards a commonly owned resource has to have some kind of logical explanation of what are the motives of the people involved. And economics relies on really two basic assumptions of human behavior. The first, that all social phenomena emerge from choices that individuals make in response to expected costs and benefits, and focuses on the importance of individual choice. The second one is that human choice is influenced in a predictable way, not perfectly predictable, but a fairly predictable way by changes in incentives. Therefore, incentives matter, and emphasizes the influence that incentives have on individual choice. Now, if you take a look at the rubric here for empirical and quantitative skills, you can see this kind of problem fits very nicely. You've got the problem in the argument awareness, and you've got the ability of the student to be able to generate some kind of summary of the scientific or mathematical problem that's at hand based on pertinent facts and data. The data is, of course, self-generated from the experiment itself. They can formulate a hypothesis, right? I can hypothesize about why the people are behaving the way they are. By the way, there are different scenarios in the tragedy of the commons. The whole thing doesn't have to be, by the way, a tragedy. It can actually have a happy ending based on the kind of scenarios that you have, whether or not there's permits or not, or whether there are quotas, and there's different kinds of techniques that you no doubt have thought of already on your own. Data analysis representation. You certainly are able to, at least students are able to, present it in a wide variety of formats, tables, graphs, diagrams, etc. And in the end, be able to problem solve, because there will be a post-experiment exercise which will allow them to apply logic and assumptions of quantitative reasoning in the context of the problem. Okay, lastly, we have social responsibility. And this is perhaps the most slippery one of them all, but it's worthy of our consideration. The definition is in blue. Include intercultural competency, knowledge of civic responsibility, and the ability to engage effectively in regional, national, and global communities. In surfing the internet about social responsibility, I found a really powerful quote from Victor Weisskopf, who's a nuclear physicist. Many of you may recognize his name right away, especially for the scientists in the room. And here it is. Human existence depends upon compassion and curiosity leading to knowledge. But curiosity and knowledge without compassion is inhuman. And compassion without curiosity and knowledge is ineffectual. Very, very powerful quote. So powerful that this quote actually influenced in a very big way how we as a discipline will approach, or as a program, approach social responsibility. So we're going to use what's called the case use method. Sounds familiar because it sounds like a lot like case study method, which many of you no doubt have heard of. It's very popular in grad schools, was made popular by Harvard Business School and mimicked by many other graduate programs all across the country. But that's not what we're going to do. Case study is very different. A case study is just a story. It's a brief account. For example, let's say some kind of crisis-informed policy decision-making. And like any kind of story, a case presents a conflict, typically some kind of tension between alternative courses of action that bring different viewpoints, interests, and values into contention that must be resolved by a decision. Well, our definition of case use will be that used by the Teaching Innovation in Economics that I spoke about before, edited by Salemi and Wallstead. And this is very different. A case use is a group of source materials on a single subject, drawn from real experience, that places participants in a decision-making analytical role. So why this definition? And why is it different than the course study method that we talked about? Well, it makes precise that difference between case use and case study. The advantage is very similar to the advantage of learning by doing versus learning by observing. By the way, both of those are perfectly acceptable ways of learning. Learning by doing can't be done all the time. In fact, learning by doing can actually be dangerous in some cases. You don't want somebody who's just learning to operate as a technician in a nuclear power plant to actually be pulling the levers and pushing the buttons, at least not yet, and certainly not on the real thing. So we do want them to be doing a little bit of learning by observing. But eventually, you got to go back to the learning by doing. And case studies typically do all the work for the student. The analysis, the synthesis, the evaluation are all presented there in the case study. But our method doesn't do that. By contrast, what it does is presents the background information and the substantive dilemma, and it requires the participants, the students, to use the information to create their own analysis. Now, this is presented really as an example only. A subcommittee of the economics program is going to have to draft its own case use example and present it to the economics program for its approval, but this will be a motivator for that subcommittee so that they can think about a problem that's similar to this. And the only reason why we can't use this, we could, but it's a little bit dated and there's too much data already on the internet about this, too many articles written about it that will kind of spoil things a bit. But the Google Books example is a great one. Google started scanning millions of books from research libraries and began to make them available on its website back in 2004. And it didn't take long. In 2005, it was the subject of a big lawsuit initiated by authors and publishers for violations of copyright. And so in this kind of a project, what you could do is students would be assigned to advise the judge in the class action lawsuit. And the written assignment would be like a memo to the presiding judge from the Attorney General of the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice. And the student their task is to weigh the public good aspect of increased access to books by the public and the potential gain and enhanced monopoly power for Google against the economic cost to authors and publishers of having free distribution of their intellectual property. Now, I think this fits in very nicely with the rubric. You've got cultural self-awareness. You might be thinking, well, what does this got to do with culture? It has everything to do with culture, because the whole notion about property rights in the first place, and in particular copyright or patents, is definitely a social construct, a cultural construct. And it's certainly not something that over 200 years ago even our country recognized. In fact, if you look at a lot of work by Ben Franklin begged, borrowed, and stole a lot of stuff that he put in his books and passed them off as his own, in spite of the fact that it is very well known now that a lot of it probably came from various sources in Europe, most notably very many sources in France, where Benjamin Franklin visited on many occasions. There is intercultural competence. There is that civic identity and responsibility that, hey, knowledge can be acquired privately, but knowledge is usually constructed socially or publicly, meaning that it's a good and it's not merely a private. Someone may be able to gain possession of it, but that doesn't mean they necessarily own it themselves. Right? And then there's sort of civic engagement and reflection on the issue. That is, we have to say to ourselves, what kind of balancing act do we play between what many reasonable people would recognize as rights that are due to authors and publishers, and balance those against sort of the obligations that we have to promoting and distributing knowledge to the general public really ought to have some kind of access to. So what's our current status? Well, all of these means of evaluating the core objectives are in proposal mode. So they're going to be first circulated to all the full-time faculty in the discipline via email and then posted in Eagle Online through the economics program form. In fact, they're already there. All of these things are already there, including this video presentation. And each full-time economics faculty is going to be enrolled in the form. What kind of issues and resolutions do we have? Well, the courses that are being proposed for the core are Econ 2301, Principles of Macroeconomics, 2302, Principles of Micro. There'll be sample syllabi posted in the core form sometime this summer, sometime before instructional day. That's the only thing that's not complete. And then the justification letters will also be posted in the core form. In fact, those are already there as I'm speaking. So what other issues are in front of us? Well, looking ahead, the next milestone is August 2013 in preparation for instructional day. The expected deliverables on that day will be the approval of the 4 core objectives by the discipline program, by the economics program. The known risks and the issues are, well, making sure that the core objectives line up with the student learning outcomes set by the economics program. I believe most of them do, but that will have to be the full judgment of the entire economics program to make that conclusion. And then the immediate next steps are the creation of those subcommittees, charging those subcommittees with the task of coming up with the instruments, and then reporting back to the full program for its approval. There's the table of contents. It's not here in this presentation, but it is available inside Eagle Online through the core objectives. And there you'll find Appendix A. It won't be labeled Appendix A, but the first one is communications example. The second one is critical thinking. That's that context-rich problem that I discussed. The third is the empirical and quantitative skills. That refers to the economics experiment. The one in class involved the tragedy of the commons. There can also be another one, potentially different one for macro. And then social responsibility is the Google Books memo, but as I stated, we may not use that. It's possible that might not be used, but a variant of that or something else may be used. In any event, thank you for listening. Take care and best wishes, and I look forward to hearing your feedback.